3 months after my daughter Nell was born, I finally understood what the word home was supposed to feel like. Not shelter, not a rental, not the apartment I'd shared with two roommates in my 20s where the heater quit every January and the landlord kept a spare key he used without warning. Home. The kind with your name on the deed and a front door you painted yourself and a backyard you could stand in barefoot at 7 in the morning with coffee going cold in your hand, watching the light come through the maple tree you didn't plant, but somehow already feel responsible for. Jason and I bought the house on Clover Ridge Road 18 months ago. 3 bedrooms, a brick exterior that had been painted over in some shade of beige I hated and immediately primed over, and a sunroom off the back with cracked windows we replaced ourselves over a long October weekend. The down payment came from what my grandmother left me. She'd worked 30 years as a seamstress and kept her savings in a credit union account she never touched. And when she died the year I turned 27, she left the balance to me with a single note. Use it on something that lasts. I thought about that note when I signed the closing paperwork. I thought about it again the morning we got the keys, when I stood in the empty living room before a single box had been carried in, and just listened to how quiet it was. Not the quiet of no one home, the quiet of something that belongs to you. Nell was born in late March. She came 3 days early, fast and loud, and absolutely nothing like the calm birth I'd been visualizing since week 32. I was on maternity leave from the high school where I taught art, and the plan, Jason's and mine, was that I'd take the spring and most of the summer with her while he finished out his regional sales cycle, and we'd figure out the fall from there. It was a good plan. It required the thing that plans always require, for other people to stay out of them. I need to explain who my mother-in-law Shirley is before I explain what she did, because the what makes no sense without the who. Shirley is 63 years old and has spent most of those years under the belief that Jason is an extension of herself rather than a separate person. This is not a dramatic interpretation. This is the conclusion I reached after 4 years of watching her refer to our apartment as Jason's place, after watching her tell people at his cousin's wedding that she'd picked out his tie, which she hadn't, after watching her walk into our guest room during a holiday visit and begin rearranging the furniture because it didn't flow. She is not a cruel woman. She is something harder to argue with than cruel. She is a woman who genuinely believes that caring about someone gives you authority over them, and that the bigger your love, the wider your jurisdiction. When Jason and I bought the house, she drove up from Louisville with a lasagna and a list of observations. The kitchen needed new cabinet pulls. The nursery should be on the north side of the house, not the south. The backyard fence was a liability. I smiled through all of it. I'd learned by then that arguing with Shirley was like arguing with weather. You didn't win. You just got wet. What I hadn't expected was that she would eventually try to move in. Nell was 11 weeks old when Shirley called. Jason had left 3 days earlier for a 2-week run through the Midwest. Indianapolis, Columbus, Cleveland, back through Dayton, the kind of trip that came twice a year, and that he hated but that we needed financially while I was on leave. He called every night. Nell and I had settled into a rhythm of our own, slow and milky, and punctuated by the sounds of a neighborhood I was only now learning. The school bus at 7:15, the couple 2 doors down who walked their dogs after dinner, the way the wind moved through the backyard maple in a way that was different from any tree I'd ever lived near before. I was sitting in the sunroom with Nell asleep against my shoulder when my phone rang. Shirley's name on the screen. I answered, expecting the usual check-in. How's the baby? Is she sleeping? Are you eating? Instead, Shirley's voice came through with that particular brightness she used when she'd already decided something and was getting around to informing you of it. Good news, she said. Dale finally got the condo situation sorted. They're listing it next month, so Tammy and the kids need somewhere to land for a while, and I figured, you've got that 3rd bedroom just sitting there. I went very still. Tammy is Jason's younger sister. Her husband Dale had been trying to sell the condo they'd bought at the wrong moment in the wrong market, and the last I'd heard, they were looking at a rental in their own neighborhood while they waited it out. They had 2 boys, 8 and 5. Can you walk me through what you're saying? I asked. Shirley walked me through it. Tammy, Dale, and the 2 boys would stay in our 3rd bedroom, the one I'd been using as a nursery overflow and changing station, while the condo sold, which she estimated would take a few weeks, maybe 2 months. She herself would take the pull-out sofa in the sunroom. She wanted to be nearby to help with Nell anyway. She said it like it was a gift she was giving me. I asked how long a few weeks had looked to Tammy and Dale. Shirley's voice shifted slightly. However long it takes. That's how family works. I told her I'd need to talk to Jason. She said she'd already talked to Jason. There was a pause I needed to breathe through. And what did Jason say? He said it was fine. A brief hesitation, and then she added, he said you'd understand. I knew, with the specific clarity that comes from 4 years of marriage to someone you love but know completely, that Jason had not said it was fine. Jason had said something non-committal in the way he did when he wanted to avoid a conflict he believed I would handle better than him. Which was not the same thing as fine. But Shirley had been translating Jason's equivocations into permissions for 30 years, and she was very good at it. I'll call him, I said. Of course, she said, but we're planning on next Saturday. That gives you a week to get the room sorted. She said it like the conversation was over, like the decision had already been made in a room I hadn't been in, and this call was just the courtesy notification. Shirley, I said, nothing has been decided. She laughed, not unkindly. Honey, you've got a baby and a husband on the road and an empty room. Let us help. I didn't argue. There was no point. Shirley heard argument as confirmation that you needed to be persuaded harder, and I had a sleeping baby on my shoulder and no energy to become a debate. I'll be in touch, I said, and hung up. I sat in the sunroom for a long time after that, watching the light move across the floor, feeling Nell's small weight against my chest, steady and warm and entirely unaware that anything was wrong. The maple in the backyard was doing the wind thing again. I thought about my grandmother's note. Something that lasts. I called Jason. He answered on the second ring, road noise in the background. She called you, he said before I could start. She said you'd already agreed. He exhaled. I said I didn't think it was a terrible idea in theory, which is not the same thing as... I know, I said. I know it's not. But she's already told Tammy it's happening. She said next Saturday. Silence from his end. Then, I'll call her. I'll straighten it out. He meant it. He always meant it. But I had watched Jason try to redirect his mother's certainty before, and what happened, reliably, was that she listened until he finished, said she understood completely, and then continued doing what she's already decided to do. Not out of cruelty. Out of the absolute conviction that she knew better than anyone what the people she loved actually needed, including what they needed to agree to. I know you will, I said, but I want you to trust me to handle this one. A pause. What are you going to do? I'm going to make sure that when Shirley shows up next Saturday, she understands clearly and permanently that this house is not available to her. Another pause. Should I be worried? No, I said. You should trust me. He said he did. I believed him. After we hung up, I sat with Nell until she stirred, and then, once she was fed and settled back in the bassinet, I made 2 more phone calls before the afternoon was out. The first was to Mr. Pruitt, an attorney my friend Paula had used the year before when her landlord tried to withhold her security deposit. He handled property and tenant matters, and he'd gotten Paula every cent back plus a letter that made her landlord think twice about ever doing it again. I left a voicemail explaining my situation in plain terms and asked if he had any availability that week. The second was to a locksmith. Not because anything needed rekeying, our locks were fine, but because I had learned in the past hour that Shirley had a spare key to our house, a key Jason had cut for her 2 years ago for emergencies, and which I had completely forgotten existed. I wanted to understand concretely how quickly I could change that if it came to it. The locksmith said same-day service was available, usually within 2 hours. Good to know. Mr. Pruitt called back the next morning. We met by video call during Nell's afternoon nap. He was methodical and plain-spoken and didn't seem surprised by anything I told him, which I found more reassuring than sympathy would have been. He asked whose names were on the deed. I told him both Jason's and mine. He asked whether Jason agreed that we did not want house guests. I said yes. He asked if I had that in writing. I texted Jason while Mr. Pruitt waited. Jason replied within 4 minutes. Absolutely. This is your call and I back you completely. Tell me what you need from me. I showed Mr. Pruitt the message. He nodded and told me what he could prepare. The week passed the way weeks do when you have a new baby and too much on your mind. Slowly in the nights, too fast in the days. Shirley sent me 2 texts about logistics. Which box had the extra linens, whether we had a pack and play for the younger nephew. I did not respond to either of them. I know that sounds cold. I want to be honest about it, because I think the honest version is the only version that makes sense. I had spent 4 years trying to find a way to communicate with my mother-in-law that she would actually hear, and I had run out of gentle experiments. Whatever I was going to say to her now needed to be said in a language she couldn't reinterpret. On Thursday, I called the locksmith and scheduled a Friday morning appointment. She arrived at 8:15 with her toolbox and rekeyed all 3 exterior locks in under an hour. The old spare key, Shirley's key, would open nothing in this house anymore. Saturday arrived overcast and cool for July. Nell had been up twice in the night, but she was sleeping now, strapped against my chest in the carrier. I used for the morning, she wouldn't settle any other way. I was drinking coffee in the kitchen when I heard tires in the driveway. Then another set of tires. I looked out the front window. Shirley's SUV was pulling in behind a rented cargo van already parked at the curb. Dale was driving the van. Through the passenger window, I could see Tammy with her hair up, and the 2 boys' faces pressed against the rear glass, looking out at the house with the uncomplicated curiosity of children who had been told they were going somewhere new. Shirley was out of her car before the engine finished settling, moving toward my front door with the purposeful stride of someone who has decided she is doing something good. She was carrying a casserole dish. She did not knock. She reached for the handle, turned it, found it locked. She tried it again. Then she knocked, 3 brisk knocks, and I saw her other hand going into her bag, searching for the key that would no longer work. I opened the door before she found it. She stepped inside with the casserole, already looking past me toward the hallway and the bedrooms, already calculating the footprint of what she'd arranged. Then she registered what was in the living room. And she stopped the way people stop when the room doesn't match the blueprint in their head. My neighbor Gail was sitting at the kitchen table. She had come over an hour earlier at my request to act as a witness, someone with no stake in the outcome who could simply observe. Gail was 67, had lived on Clover Ridge Road for 22 years, and was the kind of person who noticed everything and forgot nothing. She'd agreed without needing much explanation. Standing beside the table was Mr. Pruitt. He had driven 40 minutes to be here in person because he said some things landed better that way, and he'd been right about the deposit case with Paula, so I trusted his judgment. He had a folder under his arm. Shirley looked at Gail. She looked at Mr. Pruitt. She looked at me. "What is this?" she said. "This is me handling it," I said. Mr. Pruitt introduced himself in the calm, unhurried tone of someone who has delivered this kind of news before and has learned there is no useful way to soften it. He explained that this home was jointly titled to Jason and myself, that neither of us had extended an invitation for anyone to take up residence here, that Jason had provided written confirmation of that position as recently as Monday, and that he had a notice of trespass ready to be filed with the county this afternoon if needed. He held out the summary page. Shirley didn't take it immediately. She looked at me instead. "Jason said this was fine," she said, her voice steady with the certainty she defaulted to when she believed she held higher ground. "Jason texted me Monday that he does not want house guests and fully supports my decision about our home," I said. "Mr. Pruitt has that message." Then Jason changed his mind. "Or he never said what you heard him say," I said, which I think we both know has happened before, more than once. That landed. I watched it land. Her face moved through something complicated before it settled back into the expression she used when she was refusing to absorb something. "You have a newborn," she said. "You need help. I came here to help." "I know you believe that," I said. And I meant it. I genuinely meant it. I know that in your mind, what you planned was help. But help that nobody asked for, help everyone is expected to simply accept whether it works for them or not, that isn't help. It's deciding for someone else what their life should look like, and then showing up with a moving van to make sure it happens. I kept my voice even. Nell was asleep against my chest, and I was not going to raise my voice with her there. "I've spent 4 years trying to find a way to say this that you could hear," I said. "I'm not angry, I'm not punishing you. I am telling you as clearly as I know how that you cannot move into this house. Not Tammy and Dale either. Not today, not next month. This is where Jason and I are building our life with our daughter, and we need it to be ours." Tammy had come up from the front steps. I hadn't heard her approach. She was standing just inside the doorway, Dale just behind her. Both boys hovering at the threshold, looking uncertain the way children do when they sense something is wrong but don't know what. Tammy was looking at the folder under Mr. Pruitt's arm. Then she looked at me. I didn't know she hadn't actually talked to you, she said, not defensively, more like she was working something out. I thought it was arranged. She said it was arranged. I know, I said, I believe you. And I did. Shirley's certainty had a way of becoming everyone's assumption before anyone thought to confirm it. Tammy hadn't engineered this. She'd been swept along by the same current I'd been navigating for years. Shirley set the casserole down on the entry table, the one I'd found at an estate sale, and refinished myself. And she looked around the room the way she had when she'd first toured the house, and cataloged everything that needed to change. Only now, what she found when she looked was not potential. It was a boundary drawn in a language she finally couldn't talk around. I have never been made to feel unwelcome in my son's home, she said quietly. This is my home too, I said. It has always been my home too, since the day we signed for it. Since before that, since I saved for the down payment for 7 years. This has always been my home too, and I need you to know that, actually know it, not just hear it. There was a long silence, the specific kind that means something has finally, actually been heard. Dale said from the doorway that he'd go talk to the rental van driver. His voice was flat and not unkind. He turned around and went back down the front steps. I heard him outside, low and brief, and then the sound of the van's engine turning over. The 2 boys went with him. Tammy looked at me one more time before she followed. I'm sorry, she said, for showing up like this. I genuinely thought it was settled. I know, I said. Come meet Nell sometime. Come on a regular day, just you and me. I mean that. She nodded once and left. Shirley stood in my entry for another moment. She picked up the casserole. She looked at me like she was going to say something else, and then didn't, and walked out. I stood in the doorway and watched Tammy help her get settled back into the SUV, watched the rental van ease away from the curb, watched both sets of taillights diminish down Clover Ridge Road and disappear around the corner at the end of the block. A lawnmower somewhere down the street. A kid on a bike. An ordinary Saturday going about its ordinary business. Nell made a small sound against my chest, the half-syllable she made when she was about to wake up wanting to eat. Gail patted my arm on her way out and said she'd be home if I needed anything. Mr. Pruitt shook my hand and said he hoped I wouldn't need to call him again, but that if I did, he was available. I stood on my front steps alone after they left, Nell beginning to stir in the carrier, and I listened to the neighborhood the way I had in those first quiet days after we got the keys. The school bus route that didn't run on weekends. The particular way sound carried on this street, the maple in the backyard audible even from the front of the house when the wind was right. Jason called that evening. Shirley had already reached him. He'd listened to her version, and then he'd called me and listened to mine. He was quiet for a while after I finished. I should have said no clearly the moment she called me, he said, instead of leaving it vague enough for her to hear whatever she wanted. Yes, I said, you should have, but I handled it. How did it go? I thought about Shirley's face when she registered Mr. Pruitt's folder. I thought about Tammy at the door saying I genuinely thought it was settled. I thought about the casserole on my estate sale table, and Shirley picking it up and walking out. It went the way it needed to, I said. 3 weeks later, Shirley called again. Her voice was different, smaller, more deliberate, like she was choosing her words before she said them instead of after. She asked if she could come see Nell. A real visit, she said. Just her. I told her yes. I told her to come on a Wednesday afternoon, and that she should plan for a few hours, and that I'd make sure Nell was fed and rested, so it would be a good visit. She said thank you. Just that. Thank you. She came on the Wednesday. She sat in the sunroom where she had once intended to set up a bed and live indefinitely, and she held Nell in the way grandmothers hold new babies. Both hands, complete attention, the expression of someone holding something they understand is temporary and precious and not theirs to keep. She didn't rearrange anything. She didn't make observations about the cabinet pulls or the fence. She left at 4 o'clock and she took her casserole dish, and she said goodbye at the front door the way a guest says goodbye. Like someone who has understood, finally, what it means to be welcomed in rather than to arrive. That evening, I sat on the back steps with cold coffee and watched the maple move in the fading light, its leaves catching the last of the sun the way they always did this time of day, this time of year, in this backyard that was mine. I thought about my grandmother who had saved her money quietly for 30 years and left it to me with a note that said, "Use it on something that lasts." I think she would have recognized exactly what I did with it.